Hi, welcome to our 18th century London project on crime and punishment with me, Luke, Grace and Ingrid. We're going to be exploring Watchmen more specifically and what their role in crime and punishment was. 18th century London was a key notable period in time for constructing London as a metropolis that it is today. I think you'll find our project most interesting.
As Luke said, today we're going to talk about a known face of the 1800th century London streets, the Watchman, a person that was hired to keep the city and its citizens safe in the dimness of night. A personality that was occupied to keep order. Many historians even argue that this occupation was the forerunner to today's Metropolitan Police. Is it an interesting argument, but also a highly debatable statement, as the Watchmen were known to have a quite tied relationship to the London underworld. Was there more to the occupation than just keeping the citizens safe? By examining different historical work and follow the footsteps of a known 1800th century watchman, we will do our best to enlighten you on the matter. Now, what are we waiting for? The city does not wait. Off to explore! The duties of a watchman. Historian Tim Hitchcock argues that it was the watchman's job to keep the streets of London in order between 9 in the evening and 7 in the morning. Their tasks were to keep the streets and citizens safe by examining all suspected characters and arrest people who were noisy and committed minor felonies, misdemeanors. While supervising the streets, it will of course also have been a natural task to try and halt major criminal operations, but this was, however, not expected, as the men usually were unaccompanied in their profession. Standard tasks of the watchmen were to take care of and arrest people that were drunken out of their common knowledge and arrest vagrants sleeping in the street. Most of the arrested individuals would be kept in a watch house until the next day, till the offended picked them up for further accusations and investigations, or until the drunken people had slept off their alcohol. Historian Shoemaker thus claims that the tasks of the watchmen rarely extended to performing detective work. Further investigations of the crimes was therefore up to the offended themselves. As the watchmen often became witnesses to the crimes they detected, they would also work as natural witnesses if the offended victims chose to go to court. The presence of witnessing watchmen in court is reflected in many of the old court accounts presented at the Old Bailey proceedings online. Charles Raven and William Cornish, two watchmen, severely deposed that when they took the prisoner, he told them he had bought the sugar that night, and his wife, keeping a chandler's shop, had bought the cheese for sale of a cheesemonger in Suffolk. But the watchman making inquiry could find no such person as he directed them to. Stop thief! Stop the thief!
The hue and cry. All men and women of London were legally obligated to help catch any proceeding or escaping felon. If a person stole something, the people who saw the act or heard someone scream thief were obliged to intrude in the chase and the catching of the offender, by screaming for help with such shouts as "Stop thief" and "Murderer." Shoemaker argues that this solution ironically also contributed to more disorder in the streets, as the hue and cries did not always stay within the law when catching a felon.
How did the occupation come to be? As most occupations today, the employment of professional watchmen was financially motivated. Harris argues that in the 17th century, London was policed by a collection of unpaid part-time local officers. Householders and other freemen were obliged to participate in a rotating system that compelled everyone to undergo different constable, beadle and watchman duties. The freeman status, often unearned or bought standing, brought the freemen many accompanying advantages, as the right to trade in the city. However, Rood argues that the freemen also had to undertake numerous obligations, as hanging out a nightlight in the nights without moonlight, sweep their shares of the streets, and serve as local nightly watchmen. As the freemen often were occupied with their other professions, they were often unavailable for service when the crimes were committed. It was also an unpopular trade, as the people who you arrested often was your own neighbours. Furthermore, leading to arguments between neighbours and a possible avoidance of the freemen's other businesses, for example, coffee shops.
As a solution to this dilemma, Shoemaker argues that freemen started paying lower-ranked people to watch their streets, a solution furthermore strengthened by the 1735-37 passage of the Watch Act, an act formalising a new levy tax that would pay the full-time hired watchmen. Shoemaker argues that the institutionalization of the watchman is shown by the increasing accounted descriptions of victims crying for a watchman's help in the Old Bailey accounts. There are accounted for 32 of these cases between the 1740s and 1750s.
So where would you find a watchman? Where was their territory? The streets of the metropolis that London was becoming also became the watchman's stomping ground. In 18th century London, the streets were frequented with many traders, rich and poor. Crowded streets became common as a result, which so naturally caused accidents and, more notably, crime to transpire. London became a central hub for trading, as I have already mentioned, for coffee shops and shops in general, but London also had a high proportion of poor people who partook in illegal activity, such as selling stolen goods from the day before. It became a space for homeless to beg and steal, which was made easier under the circumstances of overpopulation. Prostitution could not be ignored as well. It became a place for these mistresses to find customers. Evidently, crime could not be avoided in a place like London, with the very busy activity undertaken and the rapid change. As Shoemaker identifies, everything was taking place on top of each other and most wishfully as close to the street walls as possible, as the mid-street often was filled with mud and gutters full of human and horse droppings. Robert Shoemaker argues the street was where most people made their living, but also where common people underwent recreation, acquaintances were made, the upper class could lavishly portray themselves, and more simply, a place for people to partake in recreational activities. The necessity for watchmen became evident in this growing city.
The watch house and watch box. The watch house was the household where the watchmen had their base. The house would usually contain a couple of prison cells where the watchers could bring the citizens they picked up. Hitchcock argues that the watch house were of simple construction, with only a couple of rooms on top of each other. The cells were normally located on the ground floor, with the drinking room above and perhaps accommodation for the watch house keeper on the top floor. The drinking room was a room where the watchmen could socialize before they went out on their walks, and the room where caught individuals were examined. The drinking room would also hold food and drinks available for the watchmen and victims during the night. Some streets had only instituted watch boxes, where the watchmen could reside when having breaks from the nightly rounds. The boxes became commonplace furniture of 18th century London and can be compared to its feature preceding 19th century police boxes.
As the watchmen often became witnesses to the crimes they detected, they would also work as natural witnesses if the offended victims chose to go to court. They would then show up here at the Old Bailey, which is today the Central Criminal Court of England and Wales, where it deals with the greater crimes that have taken place in the metropolis and serves cases from around the kingdom. The prison is named after the street on which it is located, which itself follows the line of the original fortified wall, or bailey, of the city. Back in the 1800th century, the court functioned as the session house of the Lord Mayor in the shires of the City of London and Middlesex. The presence of witnessing watchmen in the Old Bailey court was reflected in many of the old court accounts presented at the Old Bailey proceedings online.
But were watchmen always the good guys, or was there a more sinister side to the roles which they held? Here we look at suspicious contact with the underworld. The watchman's role was said to have been a low-status occupation. As Tim Hitchcock identifies, the watchmen were paid just a few pounds a year. Lack of incentive to prevent crime naturally facilitated involvement in crime. As they became known for regularly communicating with criminals, their reputation amongst the higher classes in particular was disfavoured. Historians like Emsley, Hitchcock and Shoemaker argue that some watchmen used to frequent meetings with unlawful citizens to prosper and for their own advantage. This was evident in the case of thief-taker Jonathan Wild, who was indicted for stealing 50 yards of lace worth £40 from the shop of Catherine Stetham. As noted in Old Bailey proceedings, the government and individual victims offered rewards for capture and retrieval of stolen goods. This encouraged employees familiar with the underworld to utilise this knowledge and prosper by suppressing both sides for money.
As we have seen, the occurrence of the first watchmen and police was a natural consequence of the growing metropolis of London. It was the start of a profession where men were paid to keep their own street and city quiet and safe. As Luke argued, some watchmen, due to low payments and a financial uncertainty, engaged in illegal contacts and agreements with the underworld. But this is only a small portion of the men, and an affordable disadvantage to pay for the profession, which still brings us peace and security today. I would at least not live in a world without the police. Would you?